Welcome back. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Joel. I'm the lead pastor here at Encounter, and we're really glad that you're joining us today. We're almost at the end, actually, of a series called Shelter. We took the name from, the shelter in place. That's the name of the stay-at-home order in D.C., but in most places in the country, it's being called shelter in place. And, we like that term because in the Bible, God, one of the ways in which God is described is as a shelter. God is described as the person, as a being that we can come to in the midst of trouble to find protection and to be safe. And we've been looking, the last weeks, what does it mean to find shelter in God? How do we abide with God? How do we trust God for protection? How do we trust God for provision? And today I want to actually close that series by looking at, well, what do we do then, right? Like if we've come to God, whatever that means, like we're abiding in God in a relationship with Him, and we're finding this protection from God, and in the midst of trouble, we can find peace, and we're not subject to the anxiety and fear, and we believe that God is our ultimate provider. So even when the financial circumstances change, we're fundamentally not afraid of that because we believe that God is the one who provides for us. Well, what do we do? And I don't mean what do we do, in like a practical way. Like you're still working, if you're fortunate enough to have a job right now, you're taking care of your kids, you're, exercising, you're watching Netflix, whatever, you're doing something with your time and your energy. But there is a sense in which, when we're not in the shelter of God, so much of our internal life is occupied in worrying. So much of our internal life is occupied in anxiety. And if we're going to find shelter in God and we want to let go of those feelings, of those emotions, well, you have to fill that space with something else. And the question is, what do you fill the space with? What do you do? And I think that we find a clue to that in the passage that we read this morning. So this passage in the book of Acts, Paul and Silas are just missionaries, and they're going, all over the Roman Empire at the time, sharing the gospel, and they get to this particular town, and in this particular town there is this woman who is, according to the story, possessed by a spirit of some sort that allows her to, tell the future. She's kind of like one of those, like the, crystal ball, diviner people, and the way the story is that because of this, she's found herself in this exploitative relationship where there is these people that are basically taking advantage of her and making her work so that they can pocket the money of her in the future. And Paul and Silas come across this and they deliver there. They cast out the spirit out of her, and all of a sudden these men find themselves without their source of income, and the whole city basically turns into an uproar. They try to kill them, and they end up being thrown in prison. And in prison, Paul and Silas find themselves with really nothing else that they can do. And what do? They sing. They worship. And I think that's a key to how we engage living in shelter in God. I think that Paul and Silas give us an example of what is the thing that we should do when we are abiding in the shelter of God. In the same way in which Paul and Silas, in the midst of being in prison, in a very difficult circumstances, they can lift their voices and sing to God. When we're in the shelter of God, when we're trusting God to be our protector and our provider in the midst of whatever circumstances we might find ourselves in, there's nothing left to do but sing. Now, I don't think that Paul and Silas are singing just because they're bored, which they probably are, right? Like it's not like you had card games to play, not an iPhone, not an iPhone or an iPad for them to peruse, no books. They're hanging out, it's midnight, so why don't we sing a little bit, right? But I think that there's a deeper thing going on there. I think that part of what's going on is that Paul and Silas actually have this idea of living under the shelter of God, internalized deep within their bones. And they've realized that in the midst of whatever circumstances they find themselves in, whether it's in prison or out of prison, whether it's in financial need or out of financial need, God stays the same. And if they're in this connection with God, they are abiding under the shelter of God. So what do? They turn and they worship God. The word worship, by the way, that's what it means. It means to turn and kiss. Is this expression of love and affection? Is this making much of somebody? It's kind of like lifting up the name of God. They basically, what the passage is really saying is that they jump into embracing their relationship of love with God by worshiping. And that's one of the things that we're called to do when we are in the midst of a problem, but we're also in the shelter of God. Worship, in a way, serves as an act of reorientation, where we look kind of like beyond ourselves, beyond what's going on. And because we have the faith, because we believe that God is protecting us, we're able to look towards God for shelter. Well, the things that means is that when we worship God in the midst of trouble, when we lift our voices and sing, regardless of what's going on around us, we're actually able to access a sense of peace about our situation. And the reason being because what worship does, if you think about it for a second, imagine that you're in the midst of whatever trouble you are. Imagine for a second you are Paul and Silas and you're in jail. I don't know what characters are around, probably not feeling the safest. And if all they do is just look around their situation, well, the natural thing is they're going to experience anxiety and fear and worry. And that's true for you and I too, right? Like when we're going through situations, if our job stops and the paychecks come, the bills don't stop and the bills keep coming, and you're just looking at one side with no paycheck and we're looking at one side with no bills. When there's a pandemic going on that's literally like taking people's lives, and we see around and we look at the news and we look at what's going on, that if that's all we see, of course that fear and they're going to take over. What Paul and Silas do is not that they ignore that and not that they forget that, but they actually look at it from a different perspective. What singing does, what worship does, is that elevates our perspective so that we're not only looking at what's going on, but we're also looking towards God. And you know what happens then? That the size of problems starts kind of like changing in comparison to the size of God. Imagine, for example, I don't know if you've ever seen those videos of Earth from space, right? And it's crazy to me to see them because, you see it's like this little blue ball and there's billions of people in it. And there's all these circumstances from outside. It looks much, much smaller. If you've ever, flown, when you're landing or when your plane is taking off, you can see things getting like progressively smaller, or as you're landing, they get progressively bigger. There is a matter of perspective. When we worship, we elevate our spiritual gaze towards the heavens, towards God, and the size of problems change. And at that moment, we have access to peace because of the magnitude of the power and the love of God. The psalmist talks about it all throughout the Psalms, that when he is with God, he's not afraid. He says, God is with me. God is my warrior. God is my shepherd. God is my refuge. And then over and over, you're going to see him say, whom shall I fear? I fear no man. Who can do me harm? Like there's this sense for the psalmist that when he focuses his or her gaze on God, the size of troubles diminish. When we sing, when we worship, we can access peace. Now, this is not escapism. Because there's a way in which you can hear what I'm saying and think, okay, are you basically saying that we should just ignore problems and just sing and hopefully things will magically, go away or disappear? I'm not saying that. But I am saying this, that when we worship God, our own lives, our own eyes, our own minds are opened up to the possibilities of what God can do. Okay? Because a lot of times what happens is that when we're surrounded by problems, we're paralyzed. It's so terrifying, it's so scary that we don't know how to do, we don't know where to go, we don't know how to move. And worship almost like opens up the possibility and says, no, if God is real, if God loves me, if God is with us, then there are things that God can do, there are ways in which God can move that we didn't even think of before. And usually those actually lead us into action and into steps of faith. They actually keep the hope alive that we need to keep moving forward. And you actually see that in the story, because what the next thing that happens in the story? They're singing, an earthquake happens, and all of a sudden the doors of the prison are open up, and they are free. Worship creates in our minds, opens out the possibilities for the things that God can do. Something else that singing does, something else that worship does, believe it or not, it's kind of like a protest, right? Because what you're doing when you're singing is that there's this reality around us of the things that are happening, of the things that are going on, of the troubles that are happening, of the injustices that are happening. And it could seem that that's all there is. And it could seem that everybody would say, this is okay. This is just how life is. And worship and singing is like a giant no to that. There is a God that's higher above all that's going on. There is a God of justice. That there is a God of peace. That there is a God of love. That there's more to the story than what we see. It opens up our life to say, this is not okay, and there's more, and things are going to change. I don't know if you saw a couple weeks ago, James Corden has his dad on to read some Psalms. And you start reading this psalm about justice, and I love this moment where he says, like, do not fret at the schemes of wicked man. He's quoting the psalms, kind of like speaking like this word of like just justice and peace. And that's part of what worship does. That's actually true of the civil rights movement. If you read in one of Dr. King's books, Why We Can Wait, he actually, devotes a section to talking about the importance of the freedom songs. The freedom songs were kind of like it was honestly like a lot of like hymns and spiritual songs that they kind of had adapted to talk about their struggle for justice at the time. There's this line that he says I've always loved. He says, the freedom songs are playing a strong and vital role in our struggle. They give the people new courage and a sense of unity. I think they keep alive a faith, a radiant hope in the future, particularly in our most trying hours. I'll be honest with you. I was a little worried about preaching this particular sermon because there's a way in which you can maybe misunderstand it and think that, singing is almost like a way of like, escaping from reality and not engaging in what's going on in the world and just kind of like, isolate ourselves in moments of difficulty. And this is the moment in our country where we're actually called to do the opposite. We're called to be involved in everything that's going on and enjoying that work. So I went kind of like, down the rabbit hole of the connection between singing and the civil rights movement. And I found all these incredible quotes and stories about how important singing had been to the movement. That's a quote from Dr. King that we just read. And one of the things he's saying is actually, singing is not inaction, it's action. That there's something that happens when we sing, when we lift our voices, that, it fills our hearts with hope and encouragement that we need to keep moving forward. And that's true in the civil rights struggle. That's true in the struggle right now against systemic racism. And it's true in all of the other elements in our lives. That when we remind ourselves of the larger truths of God, we're filled with the hope that we need to move forward. Something else I was saying, this is the one thing that allows us to, in whatever circumstance we might find ourselves in, to kind of like remind ourselves of the shelter of God. There's Psalm 119:54 says, your statutes have been my song wherever I've made my home. I've always loved that particular translation because it makes this connection between singing and home. And the context of the passage is kind of like a wanderer, right? Like somebody that doesn't really have a home, that like goes from place to place. And somehow he's saying, hey, when I sing to you, when I remember your loss, when I remember your justice, when I remember who you are, and I lift up my voice and sing, wherever I find myself, that place can become home because of you. In the civil rights movement, this is actually true as well. One of the most famous songs, perhaps the most famous song of the civil rights movement is the song We Shall Overcome. almost became kind of like the unofficial anthem of the movement. And Wyatt T. Walker, he was executive director of Dr. King's the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He's quoted talking about that song. He says this. He says, "One cannot describe the vitality and emotion this one song evokes across the Southland. I have heard it sung in great mass meetings with 1,000 voices singing as one. I've heard a half dozen singing it softly behind the bars of the Hinds County Prison in Mississippi. I've heard all women singing it on the way to work in Albany, Georgia. I've heard the students singing it as they were being dragged away to jail. It generates power that is indescribable." You know what he's saying? He's saying this. He's saying that worship creates shelter. He's saying that in all of these different circumstances, when people lift up their voices and sing, when people look towards the heavens in moments of difficulty, regardless of where that is, the shelter of God manifests itself in a way. That's what happens to Paul and Silas as they're in prison. They lift up their voices and they can experience the shelter of God. The particular story, in 1961, I don't know if you're familiar with the freedom rides. Basically, at that time, interstate buses were still segregated. So this group of students started like a series of protests where they would ride the buses in defiance of these segregation laws to call attention for integrating buses. And they would get to certain places and they would just experience brutal racism. They would be beaten out. They would be thrown into jail. At some point, the president has to call the National Guard in because of how bad it gets. And there's this particular story when they get thrown into the Mississippi Hinds County Jail. And this is what James Farmer, who was one of the organizers of the ride, says. He says that there's one night that they're all sitting in jail. And somebody, over the jail cell just says, "Sing your freedom song." And this is what he says. He says, "We sang old folk songs and gospel songs to which new words have been written, telling of the freedom ride and its purpose." Then he says that on the other wing of the jail, like the women were there, and they start singing as well. Then he says, "And for the first time in history, the Hinds County Jail rocked with unrestrained singing of songs about freedom and brotherhood." There's this idea that even in prison, singing, lifting up our voices towards heaven, singing about the realities of God, the realities of justice and peace and love of God, that somehow those things kind of like erupt into the scene. And we find shelter and we experience the coming kingdom as a taste. And that's what moves us to keep going forward. Now, why am I telling you all this? Listen, I don't know about you, but one of the things that I've missed during this time is actually us singing together. Like that's something for my spirit. That's something for my soul, gathering with us and singing. And if I'm honest with you, during the week, like I'm not singing as much. I'm not, worshiping as much. And that's a mistake. Because if this is true, if singing has this important role to do, if worshiping God in the midst of this has an important role to do, if we're going to make it through this, if we're going to get through, the isolation of the lockdown, if we're going to get through, the uncertainty of the economy in our country right now, if we're going to get through all of the tensions in the struggle for racial equality that's going on in our country right now, all of those things, if we're going to get through these things, we need to worship. We need to sing. We need to remember the importance of reminding ourselves of who God is and how good God is and how, in spite of everything that we see around us, that God's still good, that God still loves us, and that the kingdom of God keeps moving forward, and that the justice and peace that God promises will come to pass one day. And when we sing, we're able to remind ourselves of these truths and to access them. I've always been touched by a particular line in the Gospel of Matthew. Kind of towards the end of the life of Jesus, he has the Last Supper with his disciples. And he's about to step out of that place and go into, first the Mount of Olives, and then eventually get arrested and eventually be crucified. And this is the line. They finished having the Last Supper, and this just says, Matthew 26, verse 30. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. This is a moment right before Jesus is going to face his death. In a way, if you think about it, he's stepping out of shelter. In a physical way, he's stepping out of his building, but also in a spiritual way, he's stepping out of the protection of the Father and exposing himself to all of the things that evil would do to him. And he's going to be betrayed, and he's going to be tortured, and he's going to be crucified. He's stepping out of shelter, and the last thing that he does is that he sings. So that one day, by faith in him, you and I will be able to step into shelter and sing again. And maybe you're listening to this. Maybe you're not a Christian. Maybe you're hearing this. And maybe you are worried. And maybe you feel anxiety. And maybe you feel, unrest. And maybe you feel anger about everything that's going on. And my hope that for you, what you will listen to this morning is that in the midst of all of that, God offers you shelter. That God invites you to step into this life. That God invites you to step into this protection of Jesus, into this life that no matter what's going on, that we can find peace and that we can find hope and move forward. And if you would like to step into that, we would love to talk to you about it. We can, we have a chat going on. You can type your message in there and let us know. Or there's a connection card that you can fill out. We would love to connect with you and kind of help you in that journey of what it means to step into the shelter of Jesus, to step into following Jesus. I'm going to close with this. On 1914, it's right during World War I. There's this fascinating story about the Christmas truce that happened this year. And basically, Christmas is coming close, and the Pope at the time had actually called for a truce for Christmas for both sides of the war, and both sides rejected the proposal of the Pope. But then on the Western Front, so you have on one side, I think it's Great Britain and France and Belgium, and then you have the Germans on the other side. And in the midst of that, on Christmas Eve, somebody, and history doesn't really know who, but somebody starts singing Christmas carols. And, there's an account of what went down. It says this. It says, first, the Germans would sing one of their carols, and then we would sing one of ours. Until when we started up, "O come, all ye faithful," and the Germans immediately joined in singing the same hymn to the Latin words Adeste Fideles. And I thought, well, this is really a most extraordinary thing. Two nations both singing the same carol in the middle of a war. The Cripperian story, what happens is basically everybody decides to stop fighting. Somebody starts saying a message, hey, if you don't shoot, we won't shoot. And basically these two armies that have been killing each other in what's considered the most bloody conflict we've ever seen step closer to one another and just celebrate Christmas together. There's stories that they were exchanging cigarettes and gifts and having drinks together. One of the most touching things I read about the story is that one of the things they were able to do is they were able to retrieve their dead. Because you know anything about trench warfare, the way it works, so you have these two trenches of armies, and in the middle of that is what's considered the no man's land. And it's considered the no man's land because if you step in it, you die. Because that's where the shooting is going on. That's where the corpses of people that have died are. And this one day, people started singing, not only singing anything, singing songs of hope, singing songs of worship. And in this piece of land that was literally the domain of death, something changed. And life claimed it for itself for that one day. And so many people call it it's a miracle that happened. That this singing led to this moment of peace and truth. Guys, I think that this is probably the best example of the power that worship has. That when we lift up our voices to God, the life of God just comes rushing into that moment. I was talking to a friend earlier this week, and he was saying how it really feels like we're surrounded by death, doesn't it? Not only, the more than, I think it's like 115,000 now people that have died because of COVID, but also, the story after story of black people in America getting killed. And family members that we know that have died. Like, it just feels like death surrounds us. And in the middle of that, God sends his son to claim this domain of death for himself and for life. And that's why we sing. And that's why we worship. Because of God. So when I do something different this morning, we can have, a long period of worship, because we want to separate some time, after this for us to sing and worship. So, we have a couple songs that we're going to be singing right now. And I want to invite you, wherever you are, don't just tune off the stream, but stay and worship. And lift up your voice. Maybe you're by yourself. I don't know if you want to stand up or you want to, get on your knees, but sing. Lift up your voice, because when we're in the shelter of God, when God is our protection, when God is our provider, when God is our hope, there's nothing left to do but sing. May grace and peace be with you.